no money for their stake in the business. Shearson would loan them the funds to buy their stock, which could be repaid through the use of incentive bonuses. Shearson would even pay Johnson's taxes. In effect, management would take its cut for free. And, Sage repeated, management would settle for nothing less than 20% of the profits. Hill was speechless. He had expected tough negotiations, but nothing like this. He didn't even know where to start objecting. When Hill and Stern attempted to reason with Sage, he made it clear Johnson stood ready to scrap the whole project, or worse, take it to another investment bank. To Hill, Sage seemed to have no regard for the way LBOs were done. Andy, Hill argued, we're putting up all the money. We're taking all the risk. Get off it. Asking Shearson's investors to settle for a straight 40% return was ludicrous. Money managers placed their money with Shearson for the upside well beyond 40%. Johnson's cut, Hill felt, shouldn't top 10%. But Sage wouldn't budge. For 2 days, Hill and Stern slugged it out with the former Lehman banker. The negotiations grew emotional until the three men began shouting at each other. Both Shearson bankers would later recall them as the toughest of their Wall Street careers. Throughout, they kept in touch with Cohen, who was attending a meeting of senior American Express executives in Tucson that week. Sage is being totally unreasonable, Stern told Cohen late Thursday. As the talks progressed, his judgments grew harsher. Peter, Stern said, it's a fucking nightmare. More so than Hill, Jim Stern was amazed at Sage's behavior. As a junior investment banker at Lehman in the 70s, he had worked with Sage on Standard Brands and considered him an old friend. But now, during a heated exchange, Sage accused Stern of acting unprofessionally, an accusation that struck a nerve. That's it, I'm out of here, Stern said, rising to leave. Sage quickly apologized. Part of his intransigence, Sage would later acknowledge, was his somewhat outdated understanding of how banking relationships worked. During Sage's days on Wall Street, the client was the boss, the investment bank, the hired help. But Shearson, which would invest hundreds of millions of dollars in an RJR Nabisco buyout, wasn't hired help. It was a full partner. Sage failed to grasp the distinction. They weren't supplicants for business anymore. They were players, he would later say. Sage was also driven by disdain. He didn't feel Hill and Stern were up to the grand old Lehman standards, and he appeared to want to teach them a lesson about negotiations. Andy, Johnson said later, felt these guys were jackasses. He just didn't feel they were sharp at all. Groping for allies against Sage, Hill called Goldstone. The Davis Polk lawyer remained skeptical of Sage's demands and, for the first time, told Hill so. Look, Goldstone said, if our clients convince you they're entitled to this, great. But if there's a way I can be helpful here, I'll try. Goldstone regretted the conversation when Hill, at a crucial point of the negotiations, mentioned to Sage that even Davis Polk supported Shearson's position. Afterward, Goldstone endured a thorough chewing out from an angry Sage. Who are you representing? Sage pointedly asked the lawyer. Goldstone stayed out of the fray after that. As the negotiations wore on, Hill, with Cohen's approval, began to concede key points. Yes, Shearson would take just 2 board seats. Yes, Shearson would pay Johnson's taxes. But handing management 20% of one of the country's largest companies for free? Not only would Sage's demands chew into Shearson's profits, they would look awful to the public. Andy, you're setting yourself up for a big negative PR issue, Hill warned. Look at the raw dollars. People are going to say management is ripping off the company. Sage countered, we'll worry about that when the time comes. Nothing Hill came up with worked, and at every turn Sage threatened to walk. One part of Jim Stern wanted to call Sage's bluff, another wanted to tell him to go screw himself. Stern gained a small compromise when Sage agreed to the idea of granting management extra stock for meeting certain performance incentives, or bogeys. There would be bogeys for completing a divestiture program, for targeted operating profits, for reaching certain rates of return. But the Shearson bankers couldn't persuade Sage to back off his central demands, that those bogeys would march Johnson's cut up to 20%. At one point, Stern, in an effort to convince Sage the agreement was too rich, ordered up a computer run showing returns on an LBO priced in the upper $80 a share range. Sage scoffed at the premise. "You're crazy," Sage said. "No one would bid that." After 2 days, Hill and Stern threw up their hands and appealed to Cohen. "Peter, you're going to have to deal with Ross yourself," Stern said, washing his hands of Sage. "This guy's crazy. He's impossible to deal with." Sage, too, had had all he could stand of Shearson. That weekend, Stern refused to return his calls. By Sunday, Sage was ready to dump Shearson and call up another firm, probably Drexel. "Let's get rid of these guys and go back to scratch," he complained to Johnson, who was in Florida with Goldstone for the weekend. Johnson wasn't worried. Every negotiation was a fight, he felt, and some fights were just worse than others. Anyway, Shearson wasn't dealing from strength. In 3 days, Johnson was to go before his board and make the pitch. He knew how badly Cohen wanted this deal, and doubted Shearson would spike the entire effort over this one negotiation. "Oh, they'll come around," Johnson assured Sage. "If they don't, there's no deal." Charlie Hugel had a long flight back from Korea to think about the call from Johnson. Somewhere over the northern Pacific, he took out a pad and began jotting down things he had to do. He decided the special committee should have 5 members. Some had 3, but Hugel had planned a trip to Moscow next month and didn't want just 2 directors left behind. He wanted people who had been CEOs, who understood the way companies worked. He also wanted people who had the time, who wouldn't be griping about missed dinners during the long hours of deliberations sure to come. Returning to his Connecticut home Sunday night, Hugel called Johnson, who had returned to Atlanta. They talked about whom to put on the special committee. In effect, Hugel was letting Johnson help name his own judges. They agreed on Marty Davis of Gulf and Western. Johnson's old friend, named a director that spring, knew more about corporate restructurings than anyone on the board, having shaken up his own company repeatedly over the last 5 years. They agreed, too, on Bill Anderson, the former NCR chairman whom Johnson had blessed with an $80,000 consulting agreement. At least one of the directors, they agreed, should come from Winston-Salem. They decided on John Medlin. The most curious selection was John McAmer. After their earlier run-ins, Johnson didn't trust the former Celanese chairman. But he and Hugel agreed it would be better to place McAmer on the committee than risk his stirring up trouble among other directors. "Another thing, Charlie," Johnson said, reminded of something Goldstone had told him. "You'd better make sure the board has a lawyer. We want it to be like Santa Flush ran through there." Hugel had already put lawyer on his list. His selection of counsel would be crucial, for it would be up to the committee's lawyer to make certain that the directors acted within the bounds of their complex legal and fiduciary duties. On Monday morning, Hugel began putting out help-wanted calls to some of New York's most prestigious law firms. He grew alarmed when the first 3 said they had conflicts, a sure sign that outside banks or investment bankers were already working on the deal. Suddenly Hugel realized Johnson had gone further than he'd let on. Peter Atkins glared at the airport monitor in disgust. His American Airlines flight to Albuquerque was to be delayed indefinitely, the airline announcement said. Chicago's O'Hare Airport was fogged in. Atkins picked up his briefcase and strode through the crowds at LaGuardia to a payphone. He needed to be in New Mexico by late afternoon for an important meeting. At 45, Atkins spent more time traveling than he liked. It wasn't the jet lag that bothered him. His colleagues at Skadden, Arps, Slate, Marr, and Flom marveled at his constitution. When other lawyers tired in post-midnight negotiating sessions, the well-dressed Atkins always seemed to look like the cover of GQ, said one of his partners. The rest of us would be hanging over lampshades, but not Peter. The son of an engineer born in the Flatbush section of Brooklyn, he was one of Wall Street's top securities lawyers. Skadden Arps was the nation's third-largest law firm and by far the most active in the budding field of takeover law. Atkins picked up a phone and called his secretary to make new reservations. There was, she said, a message from a Mr. Hugel. The only Hugel that Atkins knew, and only vaguely, was chairman of Combustion Engineering. He'd call him later, Atkins told himself. Atkins's secretary made reservations aboard a United flight to Albuquerque via Denver's Stapleton Airport. He ran for the gate. When he arrived, Atkins found this flight, too, was indefinitely delayed. Denver was socked in. As he cursed his luck, he heard his name paged. He walked over to a courtesy phone and called the operator. There was a message from a Mr. Hugel. Tell him he's going to miss the biggest deal ever. Hyperbole, Atkins thought, his mind only on getting a flight to New Mexico. His secretary checked again for alternate flights and reserved him a seat on a Continental Airlines flight via Dallas. This time, Atkins sprinted for the distant Continental gate. He arrived, out of breath, but triumphant, just as the plane was boarding. As the line inched forward, Atkins took out the cellular phone he carried and dialed the insistent Mr. Hugel. 20 minutes later, Peter Atkins was in the air, flying west, and Charlie Hugel had himself a lawyer. On Monday, just 2 days before the board gathering, Johnson began to grow nervous. Every hour he checked the stock price, half expecting to see it rise. He stood prepared to kill the entire deal if the stock so much as burped. He was already on edge because of Business Week's latest Inside Wall Street column. Smoke signals say, buy RJR Nabisco, the headline advised. Citing the huge gap between the company's liquidation value and its stock price, the article quoted a money manager as saying, RJR is a big restructuring or buyout play waiting to happen. It went on to speculate, whispers have it that to avert a takeover, management plans to take the company private and then sell the tobacco unit. Only half right, Johnson thought. Food would be sold, as he and Benevento had decided, and tobacco, with its huge cash flows, would be kept. He tried to put the item out of his mind. The real shocker, though, came that afternoon, a few minutes before 6 o'clock, when news crossed the Dow Jones News Service that Philip Morris was launching a surprise $11 billion tender offer for Kraft. In vivid contrast to Johnson's plans, Hamish Maxwell had chosen to expand his empire rather than dismantle it. His announcement prompted the usual flurry of calls from investment bankers wondering if Johnson might be interested in topping the bid for Kraft. By now, their song was familiar. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Kraft is a great business. You ought to take a look. You ought to move fast. The only call, Johnson noted, came from Steve Waters of Morgan Stanley. Waters got through to Jim Welch, asking about Kraft. Before hanging up, he brought up the matter he'd mentioned to Welch just 12 days earlier. Where are you on KKR, by the way? Well, Welch said, we're thinking about it. That day, Johnson began calling directors, urging them to attend Wednesday night's dinner. When board members asked why, Johnson was cagey. It's important, was all he said. To those earmarked for the special committee, he asked whether they might be willing to serve as part of a group to study restructuring alternatives. Davis was grouchy, but said he would do it. McAmer was agreeable. Hugel got through to Anderson, who accepted. Only John Medlin backed off. I'm just too doggone busy, he told Hugel. Privately, he was uncomfortable with the potential conflict of interest of sitting on the committee while heading one of RGR Nabisco's major banks. "Couldn't you get somebody else?" Medlin asked. "What about Albert Butler?" The docile Butler was Hugel's only choice. "Has Ross already talked to you about this?" he asked Butler later that day. "No," Butler said, "but he did tell me a few weeks ago about the study of alternatives." Butler agreed to join the committee. "Just one thing," he said. A few weeks before, Johnson had graciously asked him to remain on the Reynolds Tobacco Board past his 70th birthday in May. "That doesn't have anything to do with this, does it?" Butler asked. An alarm went off in Hugel's mind. "How deep did he go into this?" he asked. "It had been a definite offer," Butler said. "Let me get back to you." Hugel hung up, miffed. He knew tobacco would be the surviving core of the post-LBO company, and he didn't like the idea of Johnson's offering a seat on its board to a current director. Directors were supposed to be neutral in this process, and that kind of offer might not look right. He called Johnson and told him so. "Albert got confused," Johnson said. "At the time I was talking to him, I hadn't even decided to go forward with this. What I meant was that I wanted him to go on the tobacco board, as it was." Hugel wasn't so sure Butler was confused. "You know, Ross, you've got to be careful on this," he warned. "This is bad stuff." Johnson then said something that Hugel would never forget. There would be, he noted, a couple of slots on the post-LBO board for independent directors. "It's something I'd like you to consider, Charlie. You'll have to make up your own mind, and we've got to get the deal done first. But we've worked so well together, I'd like you to come over. And as a director, you'd have the ability to get equity, a piece of the action." "Well, how are you handling equity?" Hugel asked, suspicious. Johnson laid it out. Hugel could get the same sweet deal management would be getting. He would get a loan to buy stock from Shearson, Johnson said, then watch it grow like topsy. A $5 million stake would probably be worth $20 million in 5 years. Hugel didn't know what to say. Did Johnson know what he was saying? Did he realize he was offering, in essence, a bribe? Was he scheming or merely naive? With Johnson, you never knew. "I can't do that," Hugel said hurriedly. "I'll be chairman of the special committee." Confused and more than a little worried, Hugel ended the conversation, suggesting Johnson call Butler to straighten out his board seat. Later, he called Butler himself. "I wouldn't say anything about this," Hugel said, "to anyone." Johnson was at home Monday night when Andy Sage called. Sage was beside himself. That day, junior lawyers had tried to bang out a compromise on the management agreement. Shearson had just faxed him a draft copy, and it was all wrong. From Sage's point of view, Shearson was reneging on several major points. "Come on over to the house," Johnson said, "and we'll get everyone together." Johnson was irritated. With less than 48 hours to go until the meeting, it was silly to have crucial matters like this unresolved. He decided to gather the group and call Shearson and settle it, once and for all. Laurie Johnson started working the phones, tracking people down. Goldstone had returned to New York for the evening, but she reached his Harvard-trained assistant, George Garr Basin Jr., finishing a Wendy's hamburger in his hotel room. In Goldstone's absence, the baby-faced 34-year-old would be their negotiator. Horrigan was tracked down at the Waverly, dining with 2 tobacco executives. John Martin came from down the street. Benevento and Henderson were located having dinner together. By the time they assembled at Johnson's house, it was past 10 o'clock. As Laurie got the group Diet Cokes, Johnson sat at the desk in his study down the hall and dialed Peter Cohen in New York. While the phone rang, he gazed at the celebrity-studded pictures on the study wall. To his surprise, Jim Robinson answered the phone. The Robinsons had just slipped into bed at their Manhattan apartment. Johnson realized he had hit the wrong speed dialing number. "Oh, shit, Jimmy. I was trying to reach Peter." "What's wrong?" Robinson asked. Johnson's voice was uncharacteristically angry. "These jackasses at Shearson," he said. "They're trying to screw us to the wall. They're just being totally unreasonable. These items they're changing on us just seem like bird shit to me, and I'm fed up with them." Robinson, who hadn't been following the group's progress in detail, didn't understand everything Johnson said. He extricated himself from Johnson and dialed Cohen at his Fifth Avenue apartment. "I don't know what the hell is going on," he told Cohen, "but apparently Jim Stern and Tom Hill have managed to piss off the Pope. Could you settle things down?" Cohen dreaded calling Johnson. He had hoped Hill and Stern could handle the management agreement themselves. Besides, he was scheduled to get up at the crack of dawn for an interview on Good Morning America. Reluctantly, he picked up the phone and reached Atlanta. "Can't we do this another time?" Cohen wondered. "It's late." "No, this has got to be done now," Johnson said. "Come on, let's get this baby done, Peter. From my standpoint, this thing is just ridiculous. It's just a bunch of bird shit. Peter, either we get this goddamn thing solved tonight or we pack up. If I have this kind of trouble with you now, what'll it be like later?" Cohen backed off. Johnson sounded upset. "We'll work something out," he said. Cohen hung up and summoned his personal assistant, Andrea Ferracci, to his apartment. Ferracci lived just 3 blocks north and was at Cohen's door within minutes. He also got Jack Nussbaum on the line. Soon, all 3 men were on the phone with Gar Basin, who had taken a seat in Johnson's study. "Love the chair," he told Johnson. "If you get this deal," Johnson said, "I'll buy you one." On the other end of the line, Cohen found himself in a difficult position. He remained uncomfortable with the sheer size of the cut Johnson was demanding. He knew how much Shearson was giving away, both in terms of control and money. But it was clear some accommodation had to be reached quickly if the deal was to be salvaged. Somehow, Johnson had to be placated. It was over in less than 2 hours. Cohen capitulated to virtually every demand Basin put on the table. Typed up by Sage's secretary that night, the management agreement gave Johnson's 7-man group 8.5% of the equity, complete with a tax-compensated loan from Shearson. If Johnson hit all his bogeys, the group's stake could easily march up to 18.5%. The package's total value could go as high as $2.5 billion in the coming years. Johnson was free to divvy up his share of the pot as he chose. His personal 1% share, Horrigan also took 1%, could be worth as much as $100 million in 5 years, according to Steve Goldstone. Johnson also received a veto and control over the board. It was unlike any major LBO agreement ever signed. Cohen allowed himself to rest somewhat easy, having wrested from Johnson the understanding that the pact would be renegotiated if the price topped $75 a share, as it almost certainly would. For the moment, though, both sides got what they wanted. Johnson had history's richest management agreement. Cohen kept the ball rolling and was able to tell his colleagues that nothing was final. When Jim Stern learned of Cohen's compromise, he was incensed. "Fuck it," he shouted, banging his fist violently onto his desktop. "I'll do this at 75, but not 1 penny more. At 75.01, it's over." At RJR Nabisco headquarters, workers began to notice changes in the air. One day, Ed Robinson ordered $40 million immediately deposited into the Golden Parachute Rabbi trusts, prompting curious looks among the financial people. Johnson and the others seemed constantly distracted. Rumors began flying. A couple of secretaries even consulted psychics. "Your job does not look secure," a seer told one. "I would recommend applying to something more stable, like the government or IBM." The second woman's psychic was even worse. "I don't see this as the job for the rest of your life," the psychic said. "What do you see?" she asked. The psychic closed her eyes and appeared to concentrate for a long moment. Then she said, "It just kind of goes poof." Johnson waited nervously Tuesday, checking the stock every hour. The next morning, he invited Goldstone, who had returned from New York, to his house for breakfast. The lawyer, growing nervous, still didn't know whether Johnson would recommend an LBO or simply discuss the possibility. Johnson ran through his speech, adding that he would indeed recommend the LBO. "Just lay it out for them," Goldstone said. "It's their choice." After breakfast, Johnson went to the office and again checked the stock. Still quiet. He made the final rounds of the inner circle, checking with each man to make sure he remained comfortable with the furies they were about to unleash. Sage, for all the Sturm und Drang of his negotiations with Tom Hill, remained ambivalent. He would support Johnson whatever happened. Ed Robinson was all for the project. "Go for it," he told Johnson. John Martin was also on board. "Pay your money," he said, smiling, "and take your chances." Horrigan, eager to enter battle, again reminded Johnson to be wary of the board. Just because Johnson kept a jar on Marty Davis's desk brimming with Fig Newtons didn't mean Paul Stick's old allies were going to hand him the company. "Guys like Bill Anderson are creatures of the establishment," he warned. "They aren't gonna like LBOs. Albert Butler is as old guard as they come. Macamer is a whiner, a second-guesser." Johnson had mentioned that Dylan Reed, Reynolds's longtime investment banker, and Lazard Frere would be excellent choices to serve as the board's investment bankers. He thought it would be great to throw Ira Harris a piece of business. Horrigan couldn't believe it. "In doing this with Shearson, you're about to give Ira Harris the biggest screwing of his life," he said. "His ego is going to get such a bruising. He's not going to be your friend. He's going to be your archenemy." Johnson's odd mixture of naivete and Machiavellian wiles never ceased to amaze Horrigan. Wednesday morning, Hugel and Atkins flew to Atlanta aboard a combustion engineering jet. After checking into the Waverly, Hugel walked next door to caucus with Johnson, as he did before most board meetings. He found him in his usual jolly mood, maybe even a bit bouncier than normal. It was clear Johnson hadn't changed his mind. The buyout was on. Hugel wanted to know how Johnson planned to approach the board that evening, and the two men walked through Johnson's speech. Hugel mentioned that Peter Atkins planned to attend the board meeting. Johnson appeared surprised. He half-heartedly suggested that maybe public disclosure of the matter could be put off, but didn't pursue it. Afterward, Hugel walked back to Atkins's hotel room and directed him to draw up a press release to be issued the following morning, if necessary. "Oh, God," Goldstone groaned when he heard Hugel had brought along Atkins. Until that moment, he had held out some hope the board wouldn't disclose Johnson's presentation that night, giving the management group a chance to finish its negotiations in secrecy. Now he knew an announcement was all but certain. The clincher was Atkins's past. Just 2 months earlier, the Skadden-Arps lawyer had had his knuckles rapped by a Delaware judge for his role in the buyout of Fort Howard, a Wisconsin paper company. The company's management had used a textbook, gun-to-the-head strategy to prod its board into a merger agreement. Atkins, representing the board, allowed talks with the buyout group to remain secret until the last minute, opting for disclosure only when the company's stock began rising. Atkins had been selected to advise Fort Howard by the company's chief executive, the man making the bid, a fact that troubled the court and called into question Atkins's actions in favor of secrecy. It is obvious that no role is more critical with respect to protection of shareholder interests in these matters than that of the expert lawyers who guide sometimes inexperienced directors through the process, the court said. A suspicious mind is made uneasy contemplating the possibilities when the interested CEO is so active in choosing his adversary. Atkins's choice of secrecy, the judge noted, was a source of concern to a suspicious mind. The opinion all but accused Atkins of selling out his neutrality to a buyout group. Goldstone guessed he was still stinging from the rebuke. Jack Nussbaum concurred. It was clear Atkins was going to be living down Fort Howard, Nussbaum recalled. We figured he was going to be holier than Caesar's wife. After Hugel left, Johnson welcomed John Grennis, the young Nabisco president, just down from New Jersey. Although few knew it, Grennis was to have been Johnson's successor. 3 months earlier, Johnson had sat with him and mapped out plans for his future in detail. Grennis would move to Atlanta from New York in early 1989 to become an executive vice president. He would be put on the board at the annual meeting in the spring. Then, at a mere 45 years old, he would become chief executive on Johnson's retirement in 1990. Grennis had done nothing but thrive under Johnson. Although never one of his inner circle, he had followed Johnson through his career, rising from liquor marketing manager at Standard Brands Canada to CEO of Nabisco in just 10 years. Grennis was as serious and introverted as Johnson was devil-may-care. He wasn't without a sense of humor. He kept an anvil in his office, but he always wore starkly conservative suits. He was wholly incapable of rousing his salesmen with stirring speeches. While Johnson was out carousing at night, Grennis would be planted in his office, catching up on paperwork. He didn't play golf. He wore lifts. But Grennis delivered results, and Johnson had brought him along rapidly. Envious rivals whispered it was because Grennis was Canadian. When he walked into Johnson's office at 4 o'clock, Grennis was unaware of the cataclysm about to engulf RJR Nabisco. He hadn't been made part of the buyout group for the simple reason that Nabisco, like Del Monte, would be sold to finance it. Grennis didn't know it, but he was about to go from heir apparent to outcast. "Johnny," Johnson said, greeting Grennis excitedly, "I'm going to do a leveraged buyout." Grennis sunk into a chair and a state of shock. He absorbed phrases and, gradually, meanings. Johnson was working with Shearson and a group of executives. But not me, it dawned on Grennis. Not me. He looked at Johnson as his one-time mentor prattled on about the incredible opportunities available to everyone in an LBO. "He's blowing up Nabisco. I'm out of a job. My people are screwed." He sat there, silent, numb. Finally, he ventured a question. "Why didn't you have everybody part of the management team?" Johnson explained it was because Nabisco would be sold. But, he added, Grennis could help find the right buyers. Johnson kept saying what a great opportunity this was for him. "You've got a wonderful watershed in your life, Johnny. If you don't like what the new situation is, somebody else will want you. You're young, you've got a lot of opportunity, the world is your oyster." And if for any reason he didn't like Nabisco's new parent, Johnson pointed out, he could resign and receive 3 years' golden parachute pay. Together with his 50,000 shares of restricted stock, Grennis could walk away with more than $7 million. "Johnny," Johnson announced, "I'm going to make you rich." Grennis walked out of Johnson's office an hour later, destroyed. He walked to the Waverly, wondering if he was dreaming. He went to his room and sat for several minutes in silence. He would have to do something, he thought. Just have to. Afterward, Johnson remained in his office, alone. Outside, the warm autumn afternoon was fading into darkness. In little more than 2 hours, he would make the biggest speech of his life. He sat at his desk, jotting down notes on a yellow legal pad. He selected his words carefully. It was just like the practice tee, he thought. Concentrate, make the necessary adjustments, and everything will work out fine. Chapter 7. Johnson rose early the next morning, the memory of Wednesday night's board meeting still fresh in his mind. He was due at headquarters for the compensation committee meeting at 8 o'clock, to be followed by a gathering of the full board. A press release announcing the LBO effort was due to go out at 9:30. As he read his morning papers, Johnson came down with an attack of the giggles. There, on the front page of the Atlanta Constitution's business section was a story headlined, "Analysts say RJR isn't likely to be involved in any merger." The newspaper had concluded that RJR Nabisco would remain on the sidelines in the latest round of food industry takeovers. In addition to Philip Morris's run on Kraft, Grand Metropolitan had launched a hostile bid for Pillsbury. "Well," Johnson told his wife, "they sure have us figured out again." Before leaving the house, he took a congratulatory call from Ronnie Grierson, then a worried one from Hugel. Several of the directors had huddled after dinner last night, Hugel said, and some, including John McAmer and Vernon Jordan, were concerned about what the LBO might mean to their $50,000 a year pensions. It might make for a difficult comp meeting. When Johnson arrived at headquarters, he found Hugel was right. That morning, the committee was to have taken up the matter of lifetime pensions for board members, a sweetening of their current 10-year deals. Now, of course, any such move might look as if Johnson were attempting to influence the board. He urged that they table the matter, and they did, although Johnson got a distinct feeling of displeasure from several directors. Johnson also fielded questions about the board's other perks, including cut-rate auto insurance. What would become of them? Irked, Johnson said they'd have to wait and see. Horrigan was in Atlanta that morning and raised a fuss about the release. As drafted, it said Johnson was leading the buyout group. Horrigan insisted his name be added, saying he feared his people in Winston-Salem would revolt if they thought Johnson was running off with the company. "We have to say it's Johnson and Horrigan," he told Harold Henderson. "There can't be any doubt left that I'm in this with him." Henderson, who could see red creeping into Horrigan's face, gave in. All hell broke loose when the announcement crossed the Dow Jones News Service at 9:35. RJR's public relations chief, Bill Liss, had risen that morning thinking the day's big news would be the third-quarter earnings report and the board's approval of a new Planters peanut factory. Moments after the release went out, the first of hundreds of calls began flooding the switchboard from wire services and newspapers, radio and television stations. They came from Ames, Iowa, and Altoona, Pennsylvania, from overseas reporters and overwrought shareholders. The local television stations were soon set up outside, and a helicopter hovered overhead, its occupants peering through the upstairs windows. Liss hadn't had a day like it since his years handling skyjacking crises at TWA. But to each of the callers, he and his 4-person staff could only say the same thing. Beyond the press release, no comment. At noon, a reporter outside headquarters told his television audience he planned to question Johnson as he left the building to go home for lunch. At the house on Whitewater Creek Road, the Johnsons' maid was watching. "Oh, Mrs. Johnson," she called to Lori, "Mr. Johnson is coming home for lunch." Lori called her husband, puzzled. "Are you coming home for lunch?" she asked. Johnson couldn't have gone home if he wanted to. The building remained under media siege all day. Even local reporters knew a $17.6 billion LBO would be the largest corporate takeover in history. It was the biggest story of the day, soon to be the biggest business story of the year. The trendy shopping center on Atlanta's north side was suddenly the center of the business world. Thursday morning, Jim Robinson was at his mother's home in Atlanta, preparing for a board meeting at Coca-Cola, which he pronounced the Southern way, Coca-Cola. Atlanta raised and Harvard trained, at 52, Jim Robinson had been called corporate America's Secretary of State. The company he had headed for 10 years, American Express, was one of the world's true financial superpowers, overseeing $198 billion of other people's money. 28 million members used its credit cards. When Jim Robinson spoke, heads of state listened. His plan to settle the Third World debt crisis had created widespread interest the year before. Robinson's manner was formal, a cross between Southern planter and establishment banker. His wife, Linda, a power in her own right, headed her own New York public relations firm. At 7 o'clock, Robinson took a call from Peter Cohen, who told him of the impending news release. Robinson was surprised. Although he hadn't kept up on details, he hadn't expected any announcement until at least the following week, if then. "How did this happen so quick?" Robinson asked. "The lawyers felt it was far enough along," Cohen said, "and the board concluded that they had to put out an announcement." It wasn't an auspicious beginning, but neither man was too worried. They weren't expecting any trouble. October 20th dawned clear and cool on Wall Street. 2 blocks north, commuters hustled from the bowels of the World Trade Center past the corner Burger King and down Broadway to the brokerage offices beyond. Talk on the street that morning was of the presidential elections just 2 weeks away and the World Series, which the Los Angeles Dodgers were poised to win. A year after Black Monday, Wall Street was still nursing its post-crash hangover. The disastrous downturn so widely predicted hadn't materialized, but neither had a recovery. Instead, Wall Street was mired in a funk. A malaise pervaded the executive suites, and brokerage earnings were down. Investors who had fled the market in droves showed no sign of coming back. Securities transactions of all types were down 22%. Since the crash, some 15,000 Wall Streeters had lost their jobs. Shearson wasn't alone in contemplating layoffs. Rumors swept the street daily of impending purges at other firms. Those who weren't scared were bored. On trading floors across Lower Manhattan, traders swapped bad jokes more often than shares of stock. The only thing flying high was paper airplanes. As it had been all year, the lone source of optimism remained the merger business, especially merchant banking. Peter Cohen was not alone. Merchant banking was on the minds of every Wall Street chief executive. Merrill Lynch bragged that its LBO portfolio generated returns of 100% a year. Not since the heyday of J.P. Morgan, Businessweek noted in a June cover story, has Wall Street been buying so many corporations. The street's lingering slump lent a new edge of desperation to the merchant banking game. Windfall profits from LBOs and bridge loans were the fastest way to shore up a brokerage's sagging profits. A single deal could generate upfront fees of $50 million or more, enough to save a firm's quarter. In June, Morgan Stanley posted a $120 million pre-tax gain from the sale of its 10% stake in a Texas chemical company. The entire firm posted record profits of $230 million in the entire year of 1987. With those kinds of numbers being thrown around, even the laggards in merchant banking, firms such as Goldman Sachs, trading colossus Salomon Brothers, and little Dillon Reed, began scanning the street for investment opportunities. At the vanguard of merchant banking was the merger crowd. Most every investment bank has a merger department, and its inhabitants are a close and incestuous lot. Their predecessors in investment banking had forged decades-long friendships with their corporate clients, attending to private placements and underwritings in a tidy, gentlemanly fashion. In the late 70s, with the proliferation of hostile takeovers, there rose a new breed of investment banker. They were mercenaries, warriors clad in $2,000 Alan Flusser suits, form-fitted Turnbull and Asser shirts, Bulgari watches, and Hermes silk ties from the airport shops at Paris and Brussels. To men like Shearson's Tom Hill and to their cousins, the takeover lawyers, almost any takeover is a good takeover, for every takeover produces a fee. To say Wall Street's merger advisors have shifting allegiances is a misstatement. They have no allegiances, period, except to their firms and themselves. All these guys, says the chairman of one of Wall Street's largest firms, have 3 balls. Loyalties 1, 2, and 3 are to themselves. Loyalties 4 and 5 are to their buddies in the deal business. Loyalty 6 or so is to their client. In their world, takeovers are deals, and the top producers are players. The top players juggle work on several deals at once. At any given time, on any number of deals, they may be simultaneously teamed with and opposed by their closest friends. While the merger makers are often compared to mercenaries, cynics might find a more apt comparison in professional wrestling, a squad of high-priced grapplers traveling from venue to venue, leaving onlookers wondering whether all that spitting and fighting was actually for real. At the merger crowd's core is an elite clique of a dozen or so top deal makers who have been fast friends and competitors for more than a decade. When they call themselves anything, it's simply the group. They grew up together, their careers intertwined in hundreds of now-forgotten takeover contests. Most graduated from college in the late 1960s, became friends while pioneering merger work in the mid-1970s, and threw surprise 40th birthday parties for one another in the late 1980s, as players in the white-hot crucible of the decade's largest deals. In addition to Hill, the group's members are Bruce Wasserstein and Joseph Perella, the first superstars of the merger era, who left their longtime firm First Boston in a huff to form their own merger boutique, Wasserstein, Perella and Company, in early 1988. Eric Gleacher, the Bantam merger chief at Morgan Stanley, Donald Drapkin, a former attorney who became vice chairman of takeover-minded Revlon Group, Michael Goldberg and Morris Kramer, a pair of attorneys at Skadden Arps, Jim Marr, a Wasserstein intimate who replaced him as First Boston's new merger chief, Stephen Schwartzman, the fast-talking president of the Blackstone Group, another leading merger boutique, and Alan Finkelson, an attorney at Cravath, Swaine and Moore. "These guys are all guys I would stake my life, my entire career on," says Drapkin. "We all have a habit of finishing each other's sentences." Although its members are scattered among several Wall Street firms, the group sprang almost entirely from a pair of investment banks, First Boston and Lehman Brothers, and a pair of major law firms, Skadden Arps and Cravath, Swaine and Moore. Most were run-of-the-mill underwriting specialists or mortgage attorneys who longed for something exciting. They thrived on the adrenaline they found in corporate combat. In one regard, American corporate merger activity can be viewed as a running chess game between these old friends. Wasserstein, in many ways the center of the group, is the acknowledged grandmaster. The brother of playwright Wendy Wasserstein, he introduced innovations in merger strategy and tactics that could fill volumes. For years, Gleacher, who first rose to prominence in the Bendix-Martin-Marietta battle, was his chief rival. By 1989, he had ceded that position to Hill, who had left First Boston a decade earlier rather than face a power struggle with Wasserstein. "In almost any deal," said Hill, "one of these guys is going to be there. Our lives are constantly crisscrossing. We're able to cut through a lot of the dancing that takes place." Says Mike Goldberg, "You see Tom Hill and Joe and Bruce and First Boston on every deal. You know each of these people and what they might do in a given situation. And believe me, you don't want to be the new man at a poker game that's been running for years." Adds Alan Finkelson, who made his career on legal work doled out by Wasserstein. "People ask me, what do I account for my success? It's a certain amount of coming of age, turning 40. The other thing has to be with my whole group coming of age. All of us are turning 40, and we help each other." The group's patriarch is Joseph Flum, a takeover lawyer of legendary proportions on Wall Street. Most of the group learned the merger business at Flum's elbow. To several, he remains a father figure. Semi-retired, gnome-like, Flum is advisor to practically all the group's members on matters professional and private, the moderator of their disputes, and, from time to time, their toughest competitor. "The fact that it's a small fraternity is good for discipline," Flum says. "I see this in small-town legal bars. You fight harder because it's like, who's going to win the chess game? It keeps you honest because everybody knows each other. Everybody knows what everybody's doing. There are no secrets." That kind of inbred thinking helped spawn the insider trading scandals that swept Wall Street in the late 80s. To the group, The investigations represented a jarring wave of McCarthyism. Almost without exception, those convicted were their friends and colleagues. The first to be named in the scandal, a high-flying Drexel Burnham investment banker named Dennis Levine, had been hired and supervised by Gleacher after leaving Smith Barney under the disapproving gaze of its merger chief at the time, Tom Hill. By far the toughest blow was the indictment of investment banker Martin Siegel, a close friend of Wasserstein's and several other group members. Unlike Levine, a fast-talking upstart, Siegel was respected, Harvard-trained, one of them. Everybody who's not in the group, jokes Gleacher, is in jail. Does the group's friendship come at the expense of their clients? Only a grand jury would know for sure. Even when on opposing sides in a billion-dollar takeover contest, its members are constantly talking to one another. These back-channel communications have become a staple of their deals. For all the camaraderie, though, the evidence indicates they are competitors first and friends second. Men like Hill, Wasserstein, and Gleacher, the first to proclaim themselves great friends, are also the first to spread gossip about the other's failures. Their multi-million-dollar bonuses often depend on knowing and beating each other. There are, of course, other important deal-makers in Wall Street circles outside the group. Felix Rohatyn, the conservative dean of establishment bankers at Lazard Frere, Ira Harris, Chicago's Lord of LaSalle Street, Jeff Beck, the mad dog of Drexel, Jeff Boise, the investment banking chief at Goldman Sachs. Like several members of the group, they would each be drawn into the vortex of RJR Nabisco. It had been a hectic week for Kravis. Philip Morris's sudden attack on Kraft presented him with a perfect opportunity to ride to the Chicago company's rescue. He had been bird hunting in Spain, but had managed to get a call through to Kraft's chairman, John Richman. Kravis offered his services should Kraft seek a friendly merger, and Richman had seemed interested without appearing threatened. Even now, Kohlberg-Kravis Associates were running the numbers on a Kraft LBO. It could be the largest in history, topping $13 billion. Kravis was also eyeing Pillsbury, which had begun talking to possible merger partners to fend off Grand Met. That afternoon, Kravis was scheduled to take in a presentation on Pillsbury's financial situation at Skadden Arps. But as busy as Kravis's week had been, it was about to get far busier. He was on the phone in his corner office, which overlooked Grand Army Plaza 42 floors below, when his secretary put a note in front of him. RJR going private at $75 a share. Kravis nearly dropped the receiver. For a second, he was speechless. It couldn't be true. Paul Rather, Kravis's right-hand man, wandered in moments later. "Have you heard?" Kravis asked quickly. "Heard what?" "Ross Johnson is going private at 75. Rather paused for a moment as the enormity of the news sank in. "Holy Christ," he said. A second thought raced through Rather's mind. "That's too cheap." Kravis began to grow angry. "I can't believe this," he fumed. "We gave them the idea. He wouldn't even meet with us." High above Radio City Music Hall, Eric Gleacher's corner office was lined floor to ceiling with green-framed photos of his family. Their pastel clothes and rough-hewn good looks made his walls appear to be one big advertisement for Ralph Lauren's Polo clothing line. A humidifier percolated behind a green plant in one corner. Gleacher was leaning back in his desk chair when he saw the headline cross his computer screen. In a flash, he swung forward and stabbed at his telephone console. "I don't give a shit what you're doing," he barked. "Get down here right now." Steve Waters was in Gleacher's office within seconds. Both men were stunned as they stared at the screen. RJR? A deal? Without Morgan Stanley? "Look at the price," Gleacher said. At $75, they quickly agreed, Johnson was stealing the company. That morning, Gleacher and Waters acted as if by reflex. Both men knew the drill. the questions that had to be answered. Was this a done deal? Who was advising Johnson? Who was advising the special committee? And, most important, how could Morgan Stanley get a piece of the action? Before they could move, however, Waters had to dart down the hall to answer his ringing phone. "What the hell is going on?" Paul Rather demanded. "I don't know, Paul. As soon as we find out, I'll get back to you." The moment Waters replaced the receiver, the phone rang again. This time, it was Kravis himself. "What the hell is going on? Henry, you'll know as soon as we do. Who is it? Who's doing the deal?" "I don't know. We're trying to find out. It could be Shearson." Gleacher and Waters hit the phones. After several minutes, during which news of Shearson's involvement crossed his screen, Gleacher reeled in the first fish, Andy Sage. Gleacher knew this was no time to come on strong. "Hey, Andy," he joshed, "what are you going to do with all that money?" Sage mumbled something non-committal. "I gotta tell you," Gleacher said, "I was a little surprised we didn't get a chance to represent the special committee. Did Shearson do something to prevent us from getting hired?" "No," Sage said. Andy Sage was a pro, and Gleacher got little out of him. Later, Gleacher reached Jim Welch. Welch vaguely assured him that Morgan would somehow get its foot in the door. Down the hall, Waters managed to collar Dean Posvar, Johnson's planning chief. Posvar told Waters the deal was all but finished. "We're just fleshing this out," he said. "We're rushing it as fast as we can, and it ought to be a done deal by the middle of next week." A window of opportunity existed, Waters concluded, but not a big one. Anyone who wanted this company would have to move fast. Jeff Beck was at Skadden Arps when he heard the news. For weeks, Beck and a small army of strategists from 4 separate investment banks had been devising defenses for Pillsbury to fend off Grand Met. That day, he and other Pillsbury bankers were holding talks with a number of potential merger partners. Beck was floored by Johnson's announcement. An LBO? Without Drexel? Without me? It made no sense. He rode downtown in a car with John Herman, a Shearson banker he knew from their days at Lehman. Herman was beaming, going on about what a coup the deal was for Shearson. "This is going to be the greatest deal ever," he said as Beck stepped out of the car at his lower Wall Street office. The Drexel banker could barely contain his anger. "I don't think so, John. I don't think so." Upstairs, Beck took a call from Kravis. "What the hell is going on?" Kravis said. "I don't know, Henry. You know we wanted to meet with him. Let me call and get the lay of the land, and I'll get back to you." Beck quickly called Johnson in Atlanta, but was stopped by Johnson's secretary, Betty Martin. "They're all in a board meeting," she said. Beck was fuming. Lock and load. He simply had to talk to Johnson. "Betty, if you don't get these guys out of that boardroom, I'm just taking names at this point. This goes beyond being urgent." Minutes later, Johnson came to the phone. "Hey man, what's going on?" Beck asked, the exasperation clear in his voice. "Well," Johnson said, "we're going to buy the company." It's nice to read about it on the tape, Ross. I don't understand you." Beck wasn't even trying to hide his irritation. It was Johnson's turn to show his irritation. "We've already got our primary partners on this, Jeff, and that's that." The mad dog had been muzzled. One of the first calls Kravis took that morning was from Dick Beatty. In the merger world, Beatty was known as Kravis's consigliere. For 15 years, he had been one of his most trusted outside advisors. Having held positions in the Carter administration, Beatty was also a fixture in New York Democratic circles, a friend of Mayor Ed Koch, and, more than a few of the city's movers and shakers believed, a possible future candidate for mayor himself. A former Marine fighter pilot, at 49, Beatty had the sandy hair, baby blue eyes, and soft voice of a kindly uncle, yet the steely gaze of an ex-Marine. Kravis's interest in RJR Nabisco was no secret to Beatty. For more than a year, his firm had been compiling analyses of tobacco litigation to fathom its impact on the company. "Did you see this?" Beatty asked. "I sure as hell did," Kravis said. "I don't believe it. We've got to find out what the hell is going on." "Dick, I don't understand it. We talked to Ross. Why didn't he come to us? This doesn't make any sense. I gave him the idea." "I know," Beatty said. "It's crazy. Why in the world is he doing this with Shearson of all people? They've never done a deal." Dick Beatty knew that all too well. After Kohlberg Kravis, his second largest client was Shearson Lehman Hutton. Bob Millard, Shearson's arbitrage chief, wasn't over his initial shock at the announcement when he took a phone call from Peter Cohen. Cohen had spent the morning in his office, pacing back and forth, watching the headlines on his Quotron. RJR Nabisco stock was skyrocketing. It would finish the day at $77.25, up more than 21 points. "God, Peter," Millard said, "this is really terrific." But the trader, who made his living following takeovers, was curious why Cohen had chosen this approach. Why hadn't Shearson tried to sew up the deal before its public disclosure, as Morgan Stanley and others so artfully did? "Why are you leaving yourself so vulnerable?" Millard asked. "Well," Cohen replied, "it had to be done this way." "What makes you so sure no one else is going to top it?" "No other company has the muscle," Cohen said. "What about other financial buyers? What about KKR?" "KKR won't do it," Cohen said. "Henry won't give Ross Johnson the deal we gave him." "So what?" Millard reminded Cohen that Kravis had moved unilaterally in recent months against targets like Texaco and Kroger. "Just because they don't have management, Peter, doesn't mean they won't bid for it. Why wouldn't they bid for it?" "Well, because they won't give Johnson the same deal we did," he repeated. "But if they buy it," Millard said, "Johnson will take whatever deal he's given." It was clear Cohen didn't understand what Millard was driving at. The trader suggested Shearson might want to feel out Kravis to see where he stood. "You'd better go talk to them," he said. Cohen didn't seem to be listening. By Thursday afternoon, the Johnson camp realized it might not be healthy to have an angry Drexel Burnham rattling about Wall Street looking for an entry into the deal. Jim Welch called Beck, who was still steaming. "This is crazy, Jim," Beck said. "The price is crazy. I don't understand what you guys think you're doing." "Why," he argued, "doesn't Johnson team up with Kravis? Why should we work at cross purposes?" he asked. Welch tried a half-hearted appeal for Beck to remain on the sidelines. "We want Drexel to applaud this deal, to be our friends," he said. Beck was surprised by Welch's naivete. "Well, Jimmy, I can assure you that we will applaud this transaction, but not the way you're thinking." "Why?" "We've been trying to get you to do this deal for 2.5 years. If you think we're going to sit back now, not be a part of the biggest deal in history, I mean, you leave me speechless. I don't know how to respond." "Well, would you consider going in with us?" "Jim, we've got other obligations." Welch called Beck twice more in attempts to snare Drexel, but Beck remained irate at Johnson's snub. As a result, Drexel, the largest piece of financial artillery on the Wall Street battlefield, was free to be used by a competing bidder. Beck had no doubt who that would be. Thursday afternoon, Kravis and Rather set aside their consternation and took in the Pillsbury presentation at Skadden Arps. Afterward, Kravis pulled Beck into a conference room. "What's going on with RJR?" he asked. "I don't know. They've cut off communication at this point," Beck said. "I don't know what's going on. But you know we've got to do this deal. Are we retained?" "Don't worry about it," Kravis said. "There's going to be a role for you." The assignment would ultimately be worth more than $50 million to Drexel. Money aside, Beck couldn't help thinking how much fun it would be beating the pants off Ross Johnson. On the 17th floor of an anonymous-looking office building tucked near the Staten Island Ferry in Lower Manhattan, a chubby investment banker named Bill Strong was on the phone. Strong sat in a cramped cubicle along a wall of identical small offices. The somewhat lowbrow setting, absent the mahogany and oriental rugs of other merger departments, reflected the historical neglect of Strong's employer, Solomon Brothers. For years, Solomon had made its millions on the trading floor, not the boardroom. Half listening to one of his major clients, Strong stared intently as details of Johnson's curious proposal inched into the public domain. As the news sank in, Strong did what any good investment banker would do. "Would you be interested?" he asked the client on the phone. "No," came the answer. Strong had to be audacious. Solomon was the sick man of investment banking. Despite all the dire predictions, only one major LBO, the Revco drugstore chain, had gone belly up, and it was a Solomon deal. When the market crashed a year earlier, only one major junk bond offering, for Dallas-based Southland Corporation, had been repeatedly rejected as unsafe by institutional investors. Solomon was its co-sponsor. Only one major bridge loan to a Norfolk-based chain of television stations named TVX had collapsed. Solomon again. For 3 years, the firm had been struggling to enter merchant banking. The results had been a string of public humiliations. Strong and his colleagues had been scrambling to pick up the broken glass ever since. On Wall Street, Bill Strong was not a big name, having just made partner 2 years earlier. But he was hard-working and energetic, possessed of an earnest Midwestern work ethic. A former accountant, he was from Indiana and proud of it. Strong looked clients in the eye and said he prided himself on honesty and integrity, traits he didn't believe were terribly widespread in investment banking. A lot of investment bankers had the same spiel. Only Strong actually seemed to mean it. Like every other banker on Wall Street, Strong was